Hey, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're stepping right behind the curtain, into the mind of someone who spent his life grappling with really fundamental questions about reality, science, spirit, and, importantly, human freedom.
Yeah, it's a fascinating look. We're diving into excerpts from Rudolf Steiner's own account of his early life, his autobiography, The Story of My Life. We've been working with, selected bits covering roughly the first 3 or so decades.
And our mission really is to unpack Steiner's own story of his intellectual and, well, spiritual path. What were the key influences, the challenges he faced, especially when his inner life met the outside world.
Right, and the insights that started shaping his really unique perspective, and maybe what little nuggets can we pull out of his experience for ourselves to understand things a bit differently.
Exactly. We're going to look at his rather unusual perceptions from childhood, some pivotal relationships he had, his intense struggle with the sort of dominant science and philosophy of his era.
And how, through all of that, he began to forge his own world conception. So, yeah, let's jump in.
Okay, starting right at the beginning, Steiner makes this really powerful statement. It kind of sets the stage for everything that follows. He says he never spoke of anything spiritual that he didn't know by, like, the most direct spiritual experience.
That's absolutely foundational for him. He saw this as his guiding principle, the thing that let him navigate, overcome illusions. And it's a conscious contrast to how he felt others saw him, maybe as a fanatic or just odd.
Right.
He explicitly says fanaticism is the one thing he knows he's free from, calling it a huge source of illusion. For him, it wasn't belief, not theory. It was direct knowing.
So everything's rooted in this direct personal experience. Even as he's navigating his academic life in Vienna, he talks about his university professors. They're like Schroer and Zimmermann. And you immediately see these, like, different approaches he was exposed to.
Oh, totally different worlds. Schroer, he describes as intuitive, almost dismissive of rigid systems, taught through living, concrete examples, especially beauty. Zimmermann, though, strictly systematic theorist.
Polar opposites, almost.
Yeah, Steiner learned from both, definitely, but he noted they did not agree well in their methods, let's say.
And then there's Franz Brentano. Steiner seems particularly, well, captivated by him, not just his ideas.
He found Brentano fascinating, a keen thinker, sure, but also prone to moments of, reverie. Steiner's description is so specific, he felt he had to watch Brentano's hands, his head movements, every glance, as much as listen to the words.
Really observing the whole person.
Exactly. And he had this distinct feeling that Brentano's thoughts, while sharp, didn't quite penetrate into reality.
Almost like they stayed abstract or in the head.
Yeah. He felt he understood Brentano's philosophy better from his philosopher's hands than from his words. But even with that feeling of disconnect, Brentano was a strong stimulus. It pushed Steiner to really study his published work.
So he's pursuing these tough academic studies, math, science, philosophy, feeling this, duty to build a solid foundation for knowledge. But at the same time, he's experiencing something totally different.
That's the core tension right there. He was simultaneously perceiving a spiritual world as a reality. He calls it a clear vision. He saw the spiritual individuality of everyone, seeing the physical body and actions as just, outward expressions of this inner spiritual core.
Yeah.
He even perceived the paths of dead men in the spiritual world.
And he shares that really poignant story about writing to a former teacher, a close friend, and mentioning this perception of a dead schoolmate.
It's so telling. The teacher wrote back, warm, affectionate, but completely ignored the part about the dead schoolmate. Steiner notes this was the pattern back then, his spiritual perceptions, just glossed over, ignored.
That must have been incredibly isolating, having these profound experiences that felt totally real, but you can't even get anyone to acknowledge them. Speaking of connections, though, he did have a really significant relationship with Carl Julius Schroer.
Oh, yeah. Schroer wasn't just a teacher. Steiner calls him a fatherly friend. He felt a deep spiritual warmth there. He talks about how things like local Christmas plays, the German dialect, literature, it all felt alive, real on Schroer's lips.
Like he embodied it.
Exactly. He gives a specific example of Schroer talking about the dialect poet Joseph Misson in his poem De Nance. And Schroer was just steeped in Goethe, constantly asking, would Goethe have felt or thought thus?
So Schroer was living in that world of ideas and literature very passionately. But even with this deep bond, Steiner saw a fundamental difference in how they viewed things.
He did. Schroer saw ideas as the driving forces, feeling life in the idea itself. Steiner's sense was different. The life of the spirit was behind the ideas. Ideas, for him, were phenomena of that spiritual life, appearing within the human soul.
And he needed a term for that distinction, right?
Right, he coined objective idealism. Because for him, the reality wasn't in the idea as a mental thing. The idea was something that appeared on the spiritual object, perceived by the mind, kind of like color appears on a physical object and is seen by the eye. It made the spiritual world objective, not just subjective.
That's a really crucial difference. The spiritual as something objectively perceived, not just thought about. Did they find common ground despite this?
They did, yeah, especially when discussing the folk soul. Schroer talked about it as a real spiritual being animating a people. Steiner felt Schroer's words on this had a tangible quality, helping him develop deeper thoughts about public life, especially in Austria.
So while he's developing these unique insights, he's constantly bumping up against this major challenge, the natural science of his day.
That became his primary inner struggle, a tension he had to resolve. Schroer wasn't as focused on natural science. He was more literature, idealism. But Steiner felt this urgent inner need to harmonize his objective idealism and his direct spiritual knowledge with the scientific worldview, which seemed so, well, remote from the spiritual.
That tension must have been constant. How did he start trying to bridge that gap?
He describes turning his focus specifically to human soul activity, thinking, feeling, willing. And when he did, he didn't just see abstract concepts. He perceived the spiritual man as a clearly visible image, full of creative forces. A direct perception, totally different from how philosophy or psychology talked about it then.
So he saw the spiritual actually woven into the human being.
Exactly. He looked at the physical sense manifestation of humans and saw how it was completed by the spirit form within it. And this led him straight to Goethe's idea of the sensible, supersensible form, that form existing right on the threshold between sensory and spiritual perception.
And he saw this not just in plants, like Goethe, but within human structure.
Yes. And his studies in anatomy and physiology actually reinforced this, leading him to his concept of the human being's threefold organization: the head nerve sense system, the rhythmic system breathing, circulation, and the limb metabolic system.
How did that threefold structure connect to the sensible, supersensible?
He saw that in the head system, that sensible, supersensible form is most clearly visible in the physical form. In the limb system, it's more submerged, letting external nature forces shape the body more. And the rhythmic processes, they mediate between these poles.
And he was insistent these insights came from observation, not philosophy.
Very clear on that. He said they came from unbiased anatomical and physiological experimentation, not philosophical ideas, even though others just saw it as philosophy. He felt quite alone in these specific perceptions.
That isolation theme again. But then he talks about finding a significant inner release. Where did that come from?
It came from reading about a conversation between Goethe and Schiller after a scientific meeting. They were discussing the botanist Basch and Goethe's big idea, the archetypal plant.
The herb plants, that key Goethean concept.
Right. And Schiller, coming from Kant, saw this archetypal plant as just an idea, a mental construct the mind makes from observing actual plants. But Goethe totally disagreed.
How so?
Goethe saw the whole thing spiritually and sensed it with his senses. He argued there wasn't a fundamental difference between spiritual and sensible perception, just a transition.
And the famous line where Goethe pushes back against Schiller.
Schiller insisted that is not an observation, that is an idea. And Goethe's reply was basically, well, isn't that wonderful? In that case, I perceived my ideas with my eyes. Steiner read this and felt this profound rest after a long struggle. It was like confirmation. Goethe's way of seeing nature was spiritual perception, aligning with his own deepest experiences.
Wow, what a moment. Not just intellectual agreement, but like validation that his whole way of knowing wasn't totally out there. Someone he deeply admired saw things similarly.
Absolutely. It created this intense inner necessity for him to just dive into all of Goethe's scientific writings in detail. Initially, he even planned to write his own work, presenting science from this spiritual perspective, building on Goethe.
But life kind of got in the way.
Yeah, the need to earn a living led to private tutoring. A huge range of subjects: math, physics, even bookkeeping. It stopped him writing his big spiritual science book right then, but it also forced him to engage broadly with contemporary science, kept him from becoming one-sided. He had to kind of keep his own deeper insights locked up while teaching the standard stuff.
And he mentioned Schroer again here, influencing his teaching approach.
Right. Schroer had argued against just cramming information and for nurturing the evolution of the full and entire human being. That pedagogical idea really resonated with Steiner, but the core challenge was still there, reconciling his perceptions with science.
Which leads directly to that big opportunity in 1884, editing Goethe's scientific writings for the Deutsche National Literature.
Yeah, a massive project. And crucial because it forced him to bring his world conception to a certain issue, to really articulate it for a public audience.
But the actual writing process seems to have been tough for him.
Very challenging. Translating his vivid inner experiences into something suitable for publication. He constantly felt that what seemed rich inside came out very paltry on the page, a source of continual inner unhappiness with his writing then.
And he quickly saw that the existing scientific ways of thinking just couldn't grasp Goethe's approach.
Exactly. The theories of knowledge, cognition in the 19th century, built mostly on studying inorganic nature, they just lacked the tools to understand Goethe's dynamic view of organic life or a spiritual element within nature.
So he realized there was no cognitive theory that actually fit Goethe.
He saw there was no theory of cognition fitting Goethe's kind of cognition. And this created such an inner need that he had to stop editing Goethe and write theory of cognition in Goethe's world conception first. It was like laying the groundwork, explaining how this kind of perception was even possible before he could properly introduce Goethe's science.
That really shows how central cognition was for him writing a whole book on it, just as an introduction. Shifting gears slightly, he mentions a positive personal time, around 1886, with the Del Grossi family.
Yes, he describes his family offering many happy hours, a spiritual atmosphere. Mentions his friend, the son, the sisters, and this intriguing, revered, but unseen father. The family honored him hugely, but seemed really nervous about Steiner ever actually meeting him.
And amidst this warmth, he describes his emotional life feeling actually torn in two.
Pulled between the Del Grossi home and his deep connection with Carl Julius Schroer. And interestingly, Schroer never visited the Del Grossi place.
It was right in this period, with this emotional pull, that the core ideas for the philosophy of spiritual activity started really taking shape.
That's right. He mentions an unpublished paper then, Nature in Our Ideals, with the seeds of it. The source gives us some lines from it that are really striking.
Yeah, let's hear those. They sound like the root of his whole idea of freedom.
He wrote about ideals as a self-contained world, complete in itself, independent of nature's whims, asking, do not our ideals possess an existence for themselves independently of the kindness or unkindness of nature, finding satisfaction in this own ideal world? He talks about divine freedom versus nature's necessity, owing nothing to nature, everything to ourselves, posing the question, we surely should finally admit that a being who knows himself cannot be unfree, and the possibility of separating natural laws from things, not being slaves to them.
Wow. That's really getting at where human freedom lies for him inside, in this ideal world and self-knowledge, not just outside. And he says these ideas came from contrasting his spiritual view with its opposite, not from debate.
Exactly. And this intense inner work period also lines up with his first encounter with Nietzsche's writings Beyond Good and Evil, specifically in 1889.
How did Nietzsche hit him?
Drawn in by the style, the sharpness, fascinated by his style. I loved his keenness. But at the same time, repelled by the way in which Nietzsche spoke of the most profound problems without immersing himself in these with fully conscious thought in spiritual experience.
So, brilliant intellect, but lacking that genuine spiritual depth,
Yeah.
in Steiner's view.
Yes. Yet paradoxically, he also recognized things in Nietzsche close to his own spiritual experience, felt a proximity to his struggle. He saw Nietzsche as tragic, a casualty of how the materialist scientific age affected deeply sensitive souls.
Like, Nietzsche was wrestling with the same lack of spiritual grounding, but without Steiner's path of direct perception to hold on to.
That's a great way to put it. Around the same time he's developing philosophy of freedom, Steiner also says he attained definite views of the repeated earth lives of man, which had been more like impressions before.
And again, this wasn't from reading or theory.
He's very clear, came from real perception. He mentions talking to Professor Neumann about it, saying conviction is possible without direct perception, but his path was perception first.
And then, interestingly, he bumps into Theosophy.
Yes. First exposure was a friend giving him Sinnott's Esoteric Buddhism, tied to Blavatsky's movement.
His reaction?
Pretty blunt. The book made upon me no impression, whatever. He was actually glad he hadn't read it before his own soul perceptions, finding its content repellent. He worried that his strong dislike for that way of presenting the supersensible might have blocked his own path if he'd encountered it earlier.
Wow, strong negative reaction. Really underlines that his insights were independent, rooted in his experience, not taken from existing traditions.
Definitely. It shows his path felt distinct, maybe even vulnerable to being derailed by approaches that didn't resonate with his direct perception.
So, the late 1880s in Vienna, intense inner work culminating in philosophy of spiritual activity, alongside complex engagement with the outside world. He talks about needing intense spiritual concentration around 1888 for his Goethe work.
Right. But his external life was packed. A wide circle of acquaintances involved in Austria's critical phenomena, nationality issues, the social question, art. He notes he could achieve this concentration even in a busy coffee house, detaching inwardly while still being interested outwardly.
And he met major public figures.
Yeah, Victor Adler, the socialist leader, noted his energetic will, even if the content seemed ordinary. Pernersdorfer, too, moving towards socialism, a strong personality.
Reading Marx and Engels must have felt like a direct clash with his inner reality.
He calls it personal distress, hearing history driven solely by material economic forces, spirit just a superstructure, profoundly difficult. I knew the reality of the spiritual, he says, that thinking, for him, was the closing of men's eyes to true reality.
But he saw the importance of the social question itself.
Absolutely, immeasurable importance. But he was convinced it had to be approached rightly from the point of view of a spiritual world conception. Felt it was being tragically mishandled by materialism. So, by 27, he's full of these external questions and riddles, while his inner grasp of soul and spirit is getting clearer.
And this inner path is pointing towards philosophy of spiritual activity. It's then, 1888, he first travels to Germany.
Invited to work on the Weimar Goethe edition, prepping the scientific manuscripts at the Goethe Institute.
He calls his time in Goethe's city a festival time.
Deeply meaningful. After living so long in Goethe's thoughts, being in the places they arose was powerful.
And being immersed in Goethe's work there brought up a crucial question about Goethe's path versus his own spiritual one.
Yeah, the question became, how do you build on Goethe's foundation, his way of seeing nature, to reach actual experience in the spirit, the direct perceptions Steiner felt he had?
How did he frame Goethe's approach?
Saw Goethe building from lower knowledge stages, lighting them up with productive thinking, feeling a union with the being of things, pointing the way to living consciously in spirit, but mostly from the angle of man's relation to the outer world.
And Steiner realized he needed the other side of that coin.
Yes. Full understanding required grasping what arises from man's relationship to himself. When consciousness gets creative, produces something from within, is that real or unreal? What validates consciousness against its own product, he concluded. Consciousness must understand itself first to confirm the experience of pure spirit.
So Goethe pointed outwards from nature. Steiner needed the path inwards from consciousness itself. After Weimar, he briefly visits Berlin and meets Edward von Hartmann.
They'd corresponded philosophically. Steiner describes Hartmann physically lying on a sofa, sharp intellect, eyes showing assurance.
What was their conversation like?
Steiner felt Hartmann spoke with complete confidence, weaving complex thoughts, overwhelming with criticism, but crucially felt Hartmann never inwardly listened to him.
And their core philosophical difference was stark.
Hartmann believed the true being of things was unconscious, inaccessible to consciousness. Steiner, completely opposite, saw the unconscious as something you could raise up into consciousness through soul effort.
And there was one exchange that really hit him hard.
Chilling, he called it. Steiner argued against assuming a concept is cut off from reality. Hartmann's retort, the very definition of concept proved it was. Steiner's reaction, definitions to be the point of departure for conceptions of life. He felt chilled to the soul, realizing how far he was from contemporary philosophy's reliance on abstract definitions over lived experience. That feeling lingered.
Oof. Definitions setting the boundary of reality. Intense. After that, his brief time in Berlin and Munich was spent soaking up art.
Found it especially enriching, significant for his later ideas about art, a different kind of nourishment, maybe.
He returned to Vienna, continued tutoring.
Especially focused on one boy whose soul he felt he'd awakened, feeling a real commitment there.
And back in Vienna, he also gets involved with a group around Marie Lang.
Marie Lang, a woman with a mystical, theosophical type of mind, made a profound impression. Found time at her home in the highest degree useful, earnest life conception, deep inner experiences in her voice, almost the ideal soul of a group of seeking men, he felt.
And Theosophy, which he'd reacted negatively to before, was present in this circle.
Yep, Blavatsky's Theosophy had reached them. Franz Hartmann, known for theosophical works, was often there. Another key figure, Rosa Merator.
He describes his relationship with Rosa Merator as, well, complex. Friendly interest, but big disagreements.
He appreciated her striving to understand the actual human personality, but disagreed clearly. She used science as a foundation, but didn't open to pure spiritual knowledge like he did. Differed on art, too. She felt he didn't penetrate the sense world enough. He sought the spiritual truth within sensible forms.
Yet, despite the differences, he valued their talks immensely.
Owed her some of the most valuable hours of my life, especially discussing the true meaning of human freedom. The circle included others like Hugo Wolf, the Merilatter brothers, Friedrich Eckstein, a devoted theosophist.
And crucially, philosophy of spiritual activity was taking final shape then, and he talked most about it with Rosa Merator.
He notes she relieved me of a part of the inner loneliness in which I had lived. Shows how vital those talks were, even with disagreement, in helping him articulate his inner world.
This Vienna period, before the longer Weimar stay, seems defined by this intense inner focus on his world conception, leading to philosophy of spiritual activity, alongside these rich, sometimes difficult, social and intellectual encounters.
It's that stark contrast. Lots of outer connections, but deep underlying inner loneliness.
And that loneliness seems tied to the difficulty of finding a way to express his spiritual perceptions understandably.
He struggled finding familiar forms for unfamiliar experiences. Felt stuck between natural science language with materialistic baggage or mystical language describing subjective states.
And neither felt right for an objective spiritual reality.
Exactly. He wanted ideas that grasped the spiritual objectively, like science grasped the physical. Mystical forms described subjective experience, not an objective spiritual reality outside man, revealed through spiritual organs.
So even writing philosophy of spiritual activity, he consciously avoided mystical language.
Yes. The ultimate experience might feel similar to a mystic's, but his approach was different. He sought a path where man surrenders, lets the external spiritual world manifest objectively. The mystic, he felt, could strengthen inner life so much it obscured the objective spiritual's true form. He wanted objective spiritual science, not subjective mysticism.
That distinction is so fundamental to his whole path. After this, he goes back to Weimar for a much longer stint, almost 7 years.
Right, back at the Goethe and Schiller Institute, editing, describes colleagues like director Bernhard Suffen, kind Julius Wall became a dear friend.
Mentions the share philologists like Erich Schmidt, impressive to others, less so to him.
He felt they were meticulous with historical methods but lacked a deeper human relation to the subject. Bound to the paper, maybe, not the living spirit behind it.
Who else did he connect with there?
Eduard von der Hellen, keeper of records, delightful conversations covering everything. August Fresenius, always harmonious talks despite differing views, though friendship later broke over Nietzsche archives. Franz Ferdinand Heitmüller brought an artistic sense, felt alienated by pure philology, saw Weimar as a drowned city stuck in the past.
And he found a real family connection in Weimar, living with the Unicke family.
Yes, Frau Anna Unicke and her children. An intimate friend, looked after his needs, valued his help with the kids' education, felt completely at home. A place friends like Otto Erich Hartleben liked visiting. Herr Unicke, deceased, he refers to as an unknown known, perceived spiritually.
And this ties back to his perceptions of souls after death.
It does. His understanding of repeated earth lives was confirmed, deepened, by encountering souls after death. The Viennese unknown father and the Weimar Unicke.
What did those encounters show him?
Saw in them what's gained spiritually after death by engaging with scientific thinking in life, a kind of ascent. Conversely, saw how crass natural scientific thinking could distance souls from the spiritual after death. Notes these two were recluses who accepted science but shrank from the moral effects of materialism.
And he's very clear. This wasn't spiritualism.
Crucially distinct, emphasizes genuine spiritual perception, not spiritualism seeking connection through external, almost experimental ways. His was inner development to perceive objective reality.
And these experiences fed back into philosophy of spiritual activity.
They did. He sought the force leading from the ethically neutral ideal world of natural science to moral impulse. Wanted to show how an individual, maybe isolated by materialism, could develop moral intuition from their own being.
This is where moral fantasy comes in.
Yes, uses moral fantasy for the source of the moral impulse in the isolated individual. Clarifies, not unreal fancy, but the force letting the spiritual world break through into individual will and action. points to Goethe. Fantasy, disciplined, can picture the spiritually real, not just the fantastic.
He also kept up his more standard philological work on Goethe.
Yes, like a paper on Goethe's psychology based on manuscript revisions. Gives the example of Goethe's differing accounts of conceiving Faust, how philology reveals shifts in memory or perspective. Found it odd such insights didn't impress specialists more.
Outside the Institute, he also hung out with a circle around the Oldens, and Otto Erich Hartleben focused more on the cultural present.
Definitely a contrast to the Institute's past focus. Hans Olden, open heart but skeptical, believed ideals should apply via artlet but maybe too cynical to fully realize it. Gabriel Rader brought serious questions about women's lives. Otto Erich Hartleben co-published the Goethe Breviary with Steiner.
And Steiner seemed comfortable moving between these different scenes.
Participated in both the discoursing or dining philologists and the Olden and Hartleben coloring circles. Enjoyed the many-sidedness of life, felt equally at home in both, though differently.
And this ability seemed to reinforce his unique take on different world concepts.
Yes, in Weimar, he came to see philosophical trends not as realities to live in, but as phenomena standing before me. Realized how little he'd lived in touch with the external world until then. The inner spiritual vision felt like the only true reality.
Describing the sense world as somewhat like a shadow or a picture compared to the spiritual.
Powerful description. Felt he lived bordering the outer, needing to consciously step across a boundary to interact. Could enter others' worlds, Sufans, Hartlebens feel at home there, but felt they couldn't enter his spiritual world similarly.
So he saw various world concepts, materialist, idealist as phenomena, not fundamental places to dwell.
Exactly. Not indifference, but felt at home only in his spiritual world, yet could feel as if at home in every other, by fully entering their viewpoint. A full participation, not judging from his own stance. Like with Otto, Harnack could enter his thoughts as a visitor, yet as if at home, but Harnack couldn't enter his.
This perspective seems linked to his strong opposition to the trend of focusing on ethics detached from a world concept.
Sartre discussing ethics in isolation without a reality foundation as undisguised skepticism, unconsciously frivolous. His conviction? Perceive reality deeply, and you find the moral right there with the natural.
He wrote a critical piece about this.
A trenchant article against ethics uprooted from all world reality in Die Zukunft. Got an unfriendly reception, tried discussing it with Hermann Grimm, whom he admired. Grimm was rather unresponsively, suggested just being friendly instead of battling ideas. Felt like cold water, reinforcing that loneliness and expressing his spiritual view.
So even with connections, his core spiritual experience and its implications remained something he largely carried alone, often misunderstood. Which brings us to his move to Berlin.
Around 1897-1899 time frame. Got involved editing the magazine for literature, working with the Free Literary Society.
Saw this as destiny placing him right in the zeitgeist to confront it directly.
His work there, editing, writing, lecturing, forced him to formulate his complex inner thoughts, using worldly concepts, finding ways to be understood. His driving question, how can a way be found whereby that which is inwardly perceived as true may be set forth in such forms of expression as can be understood by this age? Like finding different paths up a steep mountain.
This constant struggle to connect his spiritual knowledge with contemporary thought sounds incredibly challenging.
A core challenge. Gives examples. Lecture on Goethe's nature concept. Had to state Goethe's color ideas were incompatible with current physics, saw this incompatibility as a symptom of the age's limited spiritual orientation.
And a conversation with a physicist really highlights the disconnect.
Yeah, spoke with an important physicist working on Goethe, who also just stated Goethe's color theory was inaccessible to modern physics. Steiner was left speechless, became part of his inner question. Must one remain speechless?
He also describes the Berlin literary figures he met.
Felt many were more literateurs than just persons consumed by artistic identity. The purely human receded.
Mentions Frank Wedekind as particularly striking.
Vivid description. Hands capable of delicacy yet seeming brutal. Expressive head, arbitrary glance. Perceived Wedekind as a spirit alien to the present time, unaware of which past world he belonged to. As a writer, like rejecting modern chemistry for alchemy, but cynically. Saw Wedekind and Paul Schierbarth, fine spirit fixed in grotesque penetrating spirit realms, as riddles understandable through repeated earth lives showing past life baggage, future needs.
So he was actively perceiving them through his spiritual lens.
Exactly. Notes difficulty forming simple human relationships. The literature identity always intervened. Accepts W. Harlan in the fullest sense human, spoke little but brilliantly. wrote as a man needing to speak, not just a literary figure. Felt close to Harlan, felt woven into the group's destiny, but they weren't to his. Saw him, didn't grasp his spiritual activity, seemed theoretical to their theoretical dogmatizing.
And it's in Berlin he encounters Theosophy again, leading to joining the society.
Around 1900, invited by Count and Countess Brockdorff to lecture, initially on Nietzsche. Sensing interest in spirit, proposed Goethe's Secret Revelation, spoke entirely esoteric about Goethe's fairy tale.
Must have been a breakthrough after years of veiling things.
Calls it a crucial experience, finally speaking using language drawn directly from the spiritual world. Led to regular lectures for Theosophical Society members via the Brockdorffs. Clear from the start. Only speak about what he vitally experienced as spiritual knowledge.
Reiterating his lack of familiarity, general and ease with existing theosophical literature.
Yes, recalling his earlier negative view of Hartman's work. Connects joining the society to his growing inner need to share spiritual content publicly, a necessity clear before leaving the magazine around Sept 1900.
He also engaged directly with monism, especially Haeckel's version.
Gave a lecture in Vienna arguing for monism based on real knowledge of the spiritual. His view, grasp physical reality from outside, senses, spiritual from inside, spiritual awareness, forming one unified world. Senses manifest spirit, spirit reveals itself creatively in the sensible.
How did he contrast that with Haeckel's monism?
Saw Haeckel as product of the scientific age. Philosophers saw him as dilettante, scientists as fantastic building worldviews just on Darwinian observation.
Yet still found something admirable in Haeckel.
Admired his courage applying thought to science, unlike researchers sticking only to observation. Drawn to Haeckel valuing creative thought. Dedicated his book Conceptions of the World and of Life, later Riddles of Philosophy, to him, despite differences, feeling critics were unfair. Haeckel wasn't primarily philosophical.
Even quotes Haeckel. People say, I deny the spirit. Wish they could see how materials shape themselves. Then they would perceive spirit in everything. Everywhere there is spirit.
Steiner felt this showed Haeckel didn't grasp the philosophical debate. Haeckel saw spirit in nature's forces, not as a distinct realm of being or consciousness philosophically.
Another major point of contention, atomic theory.
Saw it as problematic, even within science, extending it to the spiritual, just confusion of thought. Felt the key was for scientific thinking, even about atoms, to seek a path towards the organic, the spiritual.
Felt the starting point had to be from the whole.
Yes. Atoms' atomic structures were results of spiritual organic activity, not the cause. Linked this to Goethe. Start from perceived primal phenomena, not intellectual constructs, to find spirit in nature. Quotes Goethe. The factual is in itself theoretical. Seek for nothing behind this.
Meaning the spirit is right there in the phenomenon, not hidden behind it in atoms.
Exactly. Truly receive sense data, use thought only to get to simple primal phenomena, find you're dealing with sense qualities, like color, within which spirit actually works. Felt even newer physics abandoning atomic constructions still clung to mechanistic thought, seeing concepts only as generalizations, not living spiritual realities. Materialism unconsciously maintained, felt his critique was even more valid today.
He calls these disagreements the strongest sort of experience for him.
That phrase says so much. Not just intellectual debate. His arguments were rooted in, validated by, his profound spiritual experiences.
Which brings us to what he calls a profound turning point around age 36, end of the Weimar period.
A profound revolution in his mind. His ability to observe the physical world science, life suddenly gained new adequacy and depth of penetration.
A huge contrast to his earlier experience of the physical.
Absolutely. Before, grasping big scientific concepts spiritually, easy. But sense perceptions themselves, remembering facts, great effort. The whole sense world felt somewhat like a shadow or a picture next to the spiritual world's reality.
And after this turning point,
it flipped. Strong attentiveness not previously present to sense perception awoke. Details mattered. Felt the physical sense world held something only it could reveal. His ideal became knowing this world solely through what it presented, no subjective overlay.
Saw this as a developmental stage happening much later for him.
Yes, with very special consequences. Most people blend spiritual physical perception instinctively from childhood, never getting a pure view of either. His late development of pure sense observation gave him, he felt, an entirely new world. Objectively engaging the physical revealed something concerning which a spiritual perception had nothing to say.
So not just perceiving the spiritual, His ability to perceive the physical purely uncolored by spirit developed late and was equally profound.
Precisely. And this new capacity for sharp, objective sense observation coincided with his increasing lecturing in theosophical circles, starting around 1902.
Mentions initially adapting his lectures to the audience.
Had to use certain forms of expression common in Theosophy to be understood. Gradually found his own course. Notes his lecture transcripts show him extending spiritual knowledge stage by stage, moving from the near to the remote, his own path.
Highlights Marie von Siever's role here.
A fellow worker assigned by destiny, crucial for cultivating the needed artistic, emotionally charged but unsentimental element for the emerging anthroposophical society.
And talks about countering a sentimental element in the movement.
Saw it as inwardly untrue. People seeking special, esoteric truths, forming cliques, unconsciously using sentimentality as deafness to genuine spiritual realities. Felt the crucial thing was focus on the right, on positive work presenting Anthroposophy's content, not just reacting.
So while his spiritual standing was developed, the specific content he presented kept unfolding.
Yes, notes around 1902 and after gained specific imaginations, inspirations, and intuitions shaping his public material.
Period involved practical steps like starting the journal Lucifer with Marie von Sievers.
And publishing lecture pamphlets, reacquiring rights to philosophy of spiritual activity to distribute himself. Notes had all advanced without any considerable external means, relying on inner spiritual circumstances.
Links this emerging anthroposophical activity to the broader cultural mood.
Saw widespread dissatisfaction with mechanistic knowledge, a longing of the age for knowledge materialism couldn't satisfy. Points to biologists like Oscar Hertwig abandoning Darwinism as symptomatic.
But felt this longing carried a heavy burden.
The ingrained belief only mechanistic knowledge is reliable. Felt people lacked courage to develop the active inner thought needed to engage reality more deeply. Lack of self-confession. Those escaping mechanism didn't admit needing to overcome the habits of thought that led there.
The necessary confession that senses only perceive the mechanistic.
Exactly. Senses develop naturally, oriented to mechanism. To perceive higher realities must consciously awaken deeper knowledge forces out of oneself, like nature forms senses for the physical. Felt this self-confession was a necessity of the time.
Mentions meeting Max Scheler, a philosopher, who showed inner tolerance.
Saw this as the very tolerance necessary for one who desires really to know. Openness essential to move beyond fixed thought habits.
In 1906, gave a significant lecture cycle in Paris.
Describes them, during a Theosophical Congress, as a closed evolutionary process in his soul, presenting what felt ripe regarding leading spiritual knowledge forms then. Mentions attendees like Edward Schiré, Merezhkovsky, Minsky.
Which brings us to a crucial concept about spiritual investigation. The feeling for the ripeness of knowledge.
Key point. A spiritual perception might arise, initially non-luminous, lacking sharpness, must let it sink again into the depths of the soul to ripen. Consciousness isn't ready. The soul's depths must work with it, undisturbed.
Sounds like a rigorous internal research method.
It is. Spiritual science needs no less methodical conscientiousness and disciplined knowledge than natural science, waiting on experiments, calculations. Path differs, patiently testing consciousness's capacity for truth, waiting till it's strong enough to grasp the perception without distortion.
Wow, what an extraordinary account of his own development. From those intense, isolating perceptions in youth, through navigating Vienna's academic and social scenes, wrestling with intellectual giants in Weimar and Berlin that struggle for language, the inner loneliness, finding confirmation sometimes, stark opposition others, to finally finding a path to articulate anthroposophy, fueled by that remarkable late-blooming mastery of sense observation and seeing the age's deep longing.
It's a story of relentless inner striving, trying to connect direct experience of an objective spiritual world with the prevailing, largely materialistic, scientific age, and then finding the precise path and language to share that inner reality.
And it really makes you think about knowledge itself, how we perceive reality, how we handle conflicting views, the challenge of expressing experiences that just don't fit neat boxes.
Absolutely. And that point he makes about his unique development, intense spiritual perception, making the physical world a shadow, then sense observation fully developing light around 36. He felt this allowed a pure conception of both spiritual and physical, unlike those blending them instinctively from childhood.
So here's something to ponder from that.
Mm-hmm.
Could the very way we learn to perceive the physical world early in life actually, maybe, prevent us from ever seeing its true nature, or the nature of the spiritual reality intertwined with it in a pure, unmixed way? Something definitely chew on after this deep dive.